Tonight I'm going to be discussing Islamism. And because this involves both religion and the Middle East, you might be tempted to skip it, which is why I've curated a few of my favorite hilarious juggling fails to show at the end of this piece, but you've got to listen to the information first. So, Islamism. This term in itself is highly debated. There are some who feel the term shouldn't be used at all because it correlates the religion of Islam with more specific subgroups. But for our purposes, Islamism refers to a political ideology centered around the principles of Islam. It's kind of like pornography, in that it's difficult to define, but important to understand. In literally every other way, Islamism is nothing like pornography. The term is often associated with radical Islam, but don't get ahead of yourself. Like I said, Islamism is pretty much any political ideology that involves Islam, and there is a wide range of groups that call themselves Islamists. There are some you've probably heard of, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and there are some you definitely haven't heard of, like the Swords of Truth and Black Hand, which are real. The main point I'm trying to make here is that some Islamist groups have weird names, and Islamist groups are not all the same. On a similar note, not all Muslims are Islamists, in the same way that not all Christians can play bridge. I think this metaphor is particularly apt because, much like with Islamists, there is such a small proportion of people who know how to play bridge. And honestly, why would you want to? I mean, finesse, cross-ruffing, redoubling, what even is bridge? It's just the worst is what it is. Anyway, what was my point? Oh yeah, not all Muslims are Islamists. And for that matter, not all Islamists are violent. Many groups work within the political systems in their country. So it's probably worth looking into how and why Islamism developed into what it is today. To be perfectly honest, the history of Islamism goes back as far as Islam does, but my history is going to start in the 1950s and 60s, when Arab nationalism was on the rise in the Middle East. People identified strongly as Arab, which is an ethnic classification referring to people living on or around the Arabian Peninsula. Okay. So, many Arab people at this time were calling for the unification, politically, of all Arab states, which are these ones, more or less. Then, in the 70s and 80s, Islamism came onto the political scene. But why? There are several reasons given for this, of which I will discuss only three. First, the oil embargo of 1973 drew in revenue to oil-producing countries, notably Saudi Arabia. Why the oil embargo happened and why it drew wealth to oil producers are not things I'm going to discuss. This piece is difficult enough already, and if you think I'm going to include a detailed explanation of an economic phenomenon, you must be out of your damn mind. So, Saudi Arabia's wealth increased, which drew many people from other countries to immigrate there to find work. And this meant that the very conservative Saudi culture began to spread. More and more people began to subscribe to the Saudi belief that religious governments have greater power. The specific Islamic nature of these beliefs was highly influenced by the second factor, Israel's continued presence in the region. I don't know why this piece keeps stumbling into political landmines, but here's the short version of the Israeli conflict. Israel was established by the UN after World War II, and neighboring countries were angry that it took some of their land and that it existed in general. Then in the 1970s, Israel beat some other countries in military conflict, and they turned to political Islam because they wanted to be more powerful than Israel in the future. Okay, now the third and final reason I'm going to discuss is the Iranian Revolution. In 1978 and 1979, Iran overthrew its monarchy and put in place a semi-religious government based on Islam. Some other countries thought that and thought it sounded like a swell idea, so they too tried to grant Islam more influence in the government using Islamism. I should note here that basically everything I've just said includes a pretty much caveat, since the Middle East is a very diverse region, and all the ideas I've just discussed were not universal, and God, I hate this piece. Why am I doing this again? Oh right, the money. Okay. With that, let's move on to misconceptions about Islamists that the media has presented. Number 1, Islamists hate the US. This just isn't true. While there is plenty to hate, most Islamist groups don't have anything against the US or any other Western country. As I said, most of these groups are trying to influence the government in their own countries and don't really care what the US is doing. Even within groups that do outright hate the US, not all supporters have the same beliefs on every issue. For instance, I like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, but I think Cherry Garcia is a trash flavor, and you can fight me on that. Misconception number 2. All violence in the Middle East comes from Islamist groups. Nope. Violence in the Middle East is like hating Nickelback. Everyone does it. Various Middle Eastern governments have been known to commit a murder or two, and so have Jewish and Christian militant groups, like the Network of Syrian Christians for the Defense of the Syrian Revolution, pictured here at their Christmas party. While Westerners often associate images like these with radical Islam, the truth is militias like this occur regardless of religion. Why? Let's bring out speculation cam. I personally think this is a defense mechanism for people who need to, distance themselves from the atrocities these groups commit. People don't want to believe that they could commit such violence, so they convince themselves there must be something, anything that makes us fundamentally different from them. Okay, take down speculation again, guys. Thanks. And while I'd like to say that I'm above believing these clear misrepresentations of fact, the truth is I only learned a lot of this stuff in the past week. I grew up in a very insular Christian community, and I was probably 13 when I first even heard about Islam. And the truth is, for a lot of my life, I didn't care about Islamism or terrorist groups because it all seemed very far away. I am glad, though, that I've learned a lot about the true nature of Islamists. Some of them are scary, but a lot of the time Islamist groups are just political parties by another name. There are a lot of questions that remain about Islamist groups, like how their strategies will change as political alliances change with Russia, how the Trump administration will deal with them, and conversely, how a government should deal with them. And can media ever be more accurate in depicting Islamist groups? For right now, the answers to these questions are up in the air, much like these jugglers' balls are. Roll the clip.